It was a gray morning. Thin fog moved across the runway, clinging to the rows of P-47 Thunderbolts lined wing to wing. The ground was soft from last night's rain. Mechanics worked with tools that clicked and clanked under the sound of idling engines. The air smelled of fuel, oil, and wet soil. Nothing about the place felt heroic. It was cold, damp, and routine, just another morning at war. Inside the operations hut, the pilots of the 56 Fighter Group gathered for briefing. Most were in their early 20s, jackets half-zipped, holding paper cups of black coffee. Cigarette smoke curled up toward the wooden beams above them. A chalkboard stood at the front of the room, covered in mission notes. Target, Rouen, France. Escort duty. Bomb group. 91st. Altitude. 20,000 feet. Captain Arthur Kane, the operations officer, stood beside the board with a pointer in hand. He was older than the others, 34, with 2 tours already behind him. He spoke without raising his voice, the kind of man who didn't need to. Tomorrow's run is simple, he said. We escort the bombers, we keep them alive, and we bring everyone back. The pilots scribbled in notebooks. Kane pointed to a red line drawn from England across the channel. We'll rendezvous with the B-17s over Beachy Head. Once we reach Rouen, we stay high and cover them. Do not chase fighters. Do not dive after anything that breaks off. That's how we lose people. He paused to let that sink in. You're flying the New Republic P-47. She's fast in a dive, tough as hell, but she burns fuel quick and climbs slow. Use her strengths. Keep speed, use altitude, and if you get hit, bring it home. She can take punishment. Lieutenant Jack Matthews sat halfway back in the room, eyes fixed on a map. 22 years old, from Chicago. His father was a mechanic. Jack joined the Air Corps in 1941 and had spent most of the war training pilots in Texas. This was his first combat deployment. His file said experienced, but experience didn't mean much until someone shot at you. T.O. Jack's right was Sergeant Richard Red Morgan, his wingman. Red was from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He'd worked as a farmhand before enlisting. He was talkative on the ground, quiet in the air. Everyone called him Red for his hair, though most of the time it was hidden under his flight cap. The two had trained together for months and shared the same tent at the airfield. They trusted each other, which mattered more than anything else out here. Kane went on. Weather looks decent. Cloud layer at 10,000 feet, scattered over the channel. Expect interceptors near the French coast. Reports say the Luftwaffe is sending up elements of JG-26, Messerschmitts, and Focke-Wulfs. They've been trying to hit the bomber streams before they reach target altitude. A murmur went through the room. Everyone knew JG-20XS reputation. They were veterans, disciplined, experienced, and lethal. Kane turned to face the men fully. The Germans don't think much of the Thunderbolt yet. They call it a flying tank. They think it's slow. Let them. They'll find out soon enough what it can do. The room went quiet. After the briefing, the men stepped outside into the damp morning. Mechanics were already running engine tests. The deep sound of the Pratt & Amp. Whitney R-2800 filled the air, a constant mechanical rumble that made conversation difficult. Jack walked toward his assigned plane, Lucky Lady. The nose arch showed a white silhouette of a woman painted over olive drab. His crew chief, Corporal Sam Delaney, was checking the fuel tanks. Morning, Lieutenant, Delaney said. You'll like this one. New turbo system's clean. We just finished the magneto check. Jack nodded, running a hand across the wing's edge. How's the ammo feed? Full load. 8 Brownings already. 15 seconds of trigger time if you fire straight. Jack climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The seat was cramped, instruments packed close. Armor plate behind him, a thick bulletproof glass panel in front. He ran through the checklist. Flaps, throttle, mixture, trim. The switches felt solid. The plane didn't look fast, but it looked like it could take a beating a few rows over. Red Morgan climbed into his own aircraft, Dixie Rose. He waved across the line. If this thing doesn't fall apart in the air, I'll buy you a drink when we get back. Jack called back. Make it 2. We'll need it. By late morning, the weather cleared enough for flight drills. The squadron practiced formation climbs and dives over the coast. The P-47s roared in groups of 4. their engines leaving thick trails of vapor. From the ground, the sound was deafening. After landing, the pilots gathered in the mess hall. Lunch was canned beans and coffee. The talk was light, training stories, complaints about rations, guesses on when they'd finally see action. Everyone avoided saying what they all knew. The next day would be the first combat sortie for most of them. That night, the wind rose again. Jack sat at his bunk, writing in his notebook. April 15th. Rouen mission confirmed. Weather looks good. Red seems calm. I'm not sure I am. He closed the book, placed it under his pillow, and lay down to dawn. Engines started one by one. The noise shook the walls of the barracks. Jack zipped up his flight jacket and stepped outside. The sky was pale, the air freezing. Frost covered the wings of the Thunderbolts, glinting in the early light. Ground crews moved quickly, wiping the frost away. Jack climbed in a Lucky Lady. He went through his checklist again. Oil pressure, fuel mixture, prop pitch. Everything read normal. The canopy closed, locking with a heavy click. Over the radio, the command came through. Hawk flight, cleared for takeoff. He eased the throttle forward. The aircraft rolled, tail lifting as it gathered speed. The runway blurred beneath him. Then, the Thunderbolt lifted into the air, but he glanced right. Red was there, keeping formation steady and silent. Below them, the airfield shrank to a patchwork of wet fields and smoke. Ahead, the English Channel stretched flat and gray. Jack pressed his radio switch. "Stay close, Red. No showing off today." "Copy that," Red replied. "Let's see if this tub can actually fight." The flight climbed through scattered clouds, sunlight hitting the wings. In the distance, the silver shapes of the bomber formation appeared, dozens of B-17s forming up for the run to France. Jack leveled out and checked his instruments again. Fuel pressure steady. Altitude 18,000. Everything was as it should be. Still, his hands were tight on the control stick. The squadron joined the bombers, forming a protective screen above them. The mission had begun. Their orders were simple: escort the bombers to Rouen, protect them from German fighters, and make it back. For Jack Matthews, this was the first time over enemy territory. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, it was the first day of its real test. In 01 on that runway knew what kind of legend the machine would become. But by the time the sun set over France, everyone who flew it would. April 16th, 1943. Over the English Channel, 15,000 feet. The sun was pale and low, hanging behind thin clouds. For squadrons of B-17s stretched out ahead in tight formation, silver and gray shapes glinting against the cold blue horizon. Their engines filled the air with a steady, mechanical roar. Behind and above them flew the new escorts, 24P, 47 Thunderbolt from the 56 Fighter Group. It was their first combat mission over occupied Europe. Lieutenant Jack Matthews held formation with precision, hand steady on the control stick. His Thunderbolt, Lucky Lady, felt solid in the air but heavy at every turn. The altimeter read 20,100 feet. Outside the canopy, condensation formed on the edges of the glass. He adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his wingman's position. TO is right. Sergeant Red Morgan's P-47 kept close, flying level and smooth. Red's voice came through the radio, faint under static. "All good, Hawk. Oil's running warm, but steady." "Copy that," Jack replied. "Hold position. We're halfway across." They had been briefed to expect contact before reaching the French coast. The Germans had radar stations along the shoreline and would likely intercept once the bomber stream appeared over the channel. At 20,000 feet, the sky seemed calm. But the radio frequencies were alive with tension. The lead controller called out, "Bandits forming east of Dieppe. Altitude 21,000. Looks like a dozen, maybe more." Jack's squadron commander, Captain Kane, responded immediately. "Hawk squadron copies. Maintain cover. Note diving until they commit." Ahead, the French coast came into view. Flat farmland, dotted towns, smoke trails from the factories below. The bombers adjusted, heading toward Rouen. Flak began to bloom in the distance, small black puffs hanging in the air. "Keep your eyes open," Kane said calmly over the net. Then they saw them. Small, dark shapes climbing fast from the east. Focke-Wulf 190s, maybe 15 of them. Their formation was tight, moving like a single wave. "They're coming in at 2 o'clock high," someone called. Jack adjusted throttle and scanned the horizon. He could see the sunlight flashing on enemy wings. They were close now, close enough to see the crosses painted on the fuselages. Captain Kane's voice came sharp and controlled. "Hawk Squadron, break right on my mark. Wait for it now." Jack pulled hard on the stick. The Thunderbolt rolled right, engine roaring. Red followed perfectly, keeping position off his wing. The enemy formation split into 2 groups, half diving straight for the bombers, the rest turning to meet the P-47s head-on. Jack lined up on the lead FW-190 and fired a short burst. The 8.50 caliber guns thundered. He saw tracers streak past the Germans' canopy, missing by inches. The recoil jolted the entire aircraft. "Break, Red. They're coming from behind." 2 FW-190s swept in from below. Jack threw the P-47 into a dive. The Thunderbolt dropped fast, far faster than the Germans expected. Air screamed past the canopy. The altimeter spun down rapidly. The FW-190s followed, but within seconds they began to fall behind. The P-47's heavy frame picked up speed quickly, pushing past 400 miles per hour. Jack leveled out just above the clouds, then pulled into a shallow climb. The Germans had overshot that he caught one of them in his sights, closing distance fast. When the target filled the reflector gun sight, he squeezed the trigger again. The 8 guns fired together, each round tearing through the air at nearly 900 meters per second. Pieces flew from the German fighter's right wing. Smoke burst from the engine. The plane rolled sharply, then dove toward the ground, trailing flame. Jack exhaled, steadying his breathing. "One down," he said quietly to himself. Above, the bombers pushed inland, flak thickening around them. Black clouds marked the sky. "Keep climbing," Kane ordered. "Stay above the bombers. Don't chase stragglers." The rest of the squadron reformed. Red came over the radio again, voice strained but clear. "You see that one spin out?" "I saw him," Jack said. "Let's stay focused. There'll be more." Another wave of German fighters appeared, this time from behind the bomber formation. The Thunderbolts moved to intercept. Jack climbed to intercept height, pushing the engine near full power. The temperature gauges climbed into the red point 2 BF 109 streak past, guns flashing. Jack turned hard left, cutting across their line. One of the Germans pulled up, trying to shake him. Jack rolled behind, squeezed the trigger again. Short bursts, just as Kane had drilled them. The .50 caliber fire ripped through the 109's fuselage. It began to climb sharply, then exploded in mid-air. Static filled the radio as another pilot shouted, "Hawk 3 hit. He's bailing out." A white parachute bloomed below. No one said anything for several seconds. When the air cleared, the German formation was gone, broken apart, retreating eastward. The bombers, though hit by flak, were still intact and on course for the target. That Kane's voice came through again, calm but firm. "Mission objective complete. All Hawks, form up. We're heading home." Jack looked down through the canopy. The fields of northern France passed slowly below, crisscrossed with roads, smoke rising from factories. It didn't look like victory. It looked like work. Red's voice broke the silence. "Hawk, you all right?" "Yeah. Fuel's low, but she's holding. Guess we made our point." Jack managed a small grin. Maybe they won't laugh next time. As the Thunderbolts turned west, the channel came back into view, gray, flat, endless. The bombers lumbered ahead of them, heading toward England, but by the time they landed at Halesworth, most of the squadron had returned. One plane was lost, 2 badly damaged. Ground crews surrounded the Thunderbolts as they rolled to a stop, checking for holes and oil leaks. Jack climbed out of his cockpit. The smell of fuel and burned gunpowder clung to the air. He looked at Lucky Lady. 3 hits on the wing, 1 near the tail, nothing critical. The plane had done its job. Captain Kane approached, removing his flight gloves. "How'd she handle?" "Better than I expected," Jack said. "Takes a hit, keeps flying." Kane nodded. "That's what she's built for." That evening, the debriefing was short. The mission had been a success. The bombers reached the target, minimal losses. The Germans had engaged but failed to break through. Before leaving, Kane added a final remark. The Luftwaffe won't underestimate that machine again. They thought it was slow. Today proved otherwise. Jack wrote one line in his logbook before turning in. First mission complete. 2 confirmed kills. The Jug can fight. Outside, the wind shifted over the airfield. The engines were silent now, but the scent of burned fuel lingered. Tomorrow, they would go again. Late April 1943. RAF Halesworth, Suffolk. The weather turned cold again. Wind blew in from the North Sea, rattling the canvas walls of the maintenance hangars. Every morning began the same way. A layer of fog on the runway, coffee in tin mugs, the sound of distant engines warming up. The 56 Fighter Group had flown 7 missions since Rouen. None were easy. The Germans had learned quickly. They no longer dove head-on into the Thunderbolts. Instead, they attacked from high above, striking fast, then disappearing before the heavier P-47s could climb after them. The first few days had been rough. 2 pilots were missing, 1 confirmed dead, and several planes came back so badly damaged that ground crews stripped them for parts. The men were learning what the aircraft could do and what it couldn't. Jack Matthews kept a small notebook tucked into his flight jacket. Every time he flew, he wrote down how the plane handled: fuel consumption, climb rates, ammunition counts. His entries were short, factual, and precise. April 21st. Engine temp too high at full throttle. Dive speed exceptional. Turning still poor above 15,000. 8 guns accurate, recoil heavy. Plane can take hits, he read through his notes at breakfast one morning while Red Morgan sat across from him, scraping the last of the powdered eggs off his tray. You really think anyone reads that stuff? Red asked. Maybe. Someday, Jack said. Hell, I can tell you right now what the plane does. It eats fuel and hates corners. Jack didn't look up. That's why we don't turn with them. The briefing that day confirmed it. Captain Kane drew 3 circles on the board, each representing combat altitude. JG-26 is adapting, he said. They're climbing above our escort range and diving through the bomber formations. When you see them coming, don't climb. Let them pass, then hit them when they level out. Our best advantage is dive speed. Use it. He pointed at the younger pilots near the back. You all want dogfight. Don't. You'll die doing that. The Jug isn't a Spitfire. After the meeting, the men filed out, most heading for the hangars. Jack stayed behind a moment, studying the map. The red lines across France looked no different from the ones they'd drawn a week ago. Only the faces in the room were changing. That afternoon, a test flight was scheduled to evaluate engine performance. Jack and Red took off in formation, climbing through scattered clouds. The air was smooth above 10,000 feet. Jack leveled out, adjusting throttle to 2,400 RPM. You still think she's slow? Red asked over the radio. Until we point her nose down, Jack replied. They rolled into a shallow dive. The P-47 picked up speed fast, the airframe shaking slightly as the altimeter wound down. The dive gauge climbed past 400 miles per hour. Feels like she could tear herself apart. Red said. She won't. She's built for this. They leveled out at 6,000 feet, engines roaring, then climbed back toward base. Back on the ground, Jack spoke with the crew chief, Corporal Delaney. You ever wonder why she's so heavy? Jack asked. Delaney grinned. Because the designers wanted you to live through your first mistake. Jack nodded, looking at the thick armor plates along the fuselage. Seems to be working so far. By early May, the 56th had settled into a rhythm. Flights went out almost daily. Escort, sweep, escort again. The missions blended together. Takeoff, rendezvous, contact, return. The only thing that changed was how many planes came back point one evening. After a long sortie over the coast near Calais, the squadron gathered for debriefing. The airfield lights cast long shadows through the open hangar. Captain Kane addressed the room. They're adapting, but so are we. You've proven this plane can dive faster and hit harder than anything in the air right now. The Luftwaffe knows it. Keep using that advantage. Stay high, stay fast, don't get dragged down. He looked around at the faces in front of him, tired, streaked with engine grime. We're not here to win duels. We're here to win the air war. Remember that. After the meeting, Jack and Red walked out into the night. The engines were silent now. A single P-47 sat at the far end of the field, moonlight reflecting off its wing. Red kicked at the dirt. You think it ever gets easier? Jack thought for a moment. No, you just stop expecting it to. The next morning came early. Another mission. Another target. WY now. The German pilots no longer laughed when they saw the Thunderbolt. Reports intercepted by intelligence described it as fast in a dive, difficult to destroy. One Luftwaffe pilot wrote, "The American fighter can take hits that would break ours apart. Its firepower is overwhelming." In less than a month, the reputation of the P-47 had changed completely. It was no longer a curiosity. It was a threat. For the men who flew it, that knowledge didn't feel like pride. It felt like pressure. The machine could survive almost anything. They still had to survive with it. Jack closed his notebook that night and marked the date, May 2nd, 1943. We're learning. So are they. The war in the air had turned into a contest of adaptation. Whoever learned faster would live longer. And the jug was just getting started. June 1943. RAF Halesworth, Suffolk. The airfield no longer felt new. The mud had been replaced with compacted dirt, the hangars with corrugated metal. The mechanics worked faster now, practiced in repairing bullet holes and burned-out engines. Every surface smelled of fuel and solvent. The 56 Fighter Group had changed too. The new pilots were quieter, less eager to joke. The older ones, the ones who had been here since the spring, carried a particular calmness that came from surviving enough missions to understand their odds. Lieutenant Jack Matthews had logged 47 combat hours. His P-47 Lucky Lady had been hit 11 times and was still flying. He had stopped counting the number of times he'd seen a parachute open below him. The squadron's assignment had shifted. The Thunderbolt was no longer just an escort. The bombers now had longer-range coverage from new bases and other fighters. The 56th was being used for what the aircraft did best, low-altitude strikes. They called it fighter-bomber work, though the pilots called it something else, tank busting. Their targets were convoys, rail lines, and airfields in northern France and Belgium. The missions were lower, faster, and more dangerous than high-altitude escort. German flak crews had adapted. The sky over every road and train yard now flashed with gunfire like at dawn. The pilots gathered for the new briefing. Captain Arthur Kane stood at the front, pointer in hand, a photograph clipped to the board, an aerial shot of a French train depot outside Lille. "This is the objective," he said. "Fuel cars, supply trucks, anything with wheels. You'll go in at 500 feet. Use your guns, not your mouths. Don't linger. The Germans have 20mm flak guns on every approach." He looked around the room. "You've all seen what those can do. AP-47 can take hits, but it's not invincible. Don't make them prove it." The room was silent except for the sound of pencils scratching notes. Kane turned to Jack. "Matthews, you're leading second flight. You'll approach from the west. Morgan, stay tight on him." "Yes, sir," Jack said. After the meeting, Red caught up with him outside. 500 feet? That's low enough to see their faces. "Yeah," Jack said, fastening his gloves. "Let's hope we don't." By 8 o'clock, the Thunderbolts were lined up on the runway. The mechanics stepped back, covering their ears as engines roared to life. Jack's canopy rattled from the vibration. The mission call sign came over the radio. "Hawk Squadron, cleared for departure." The takeoff was smooth. They climbed to 8,000 feet before crossing the coast, descending steadily as they reached the French shoreline. Below them stretched farmland, villages, and narrow roads. The sun was already high, lighting every field and river in pale gold. At 2,000 feet, Kane's voice came over the radio. "Target area in 2 minutes. Switch to guns." Jack armed his Brownings. The toggle clicks were loud in his headset. Ahead, smoke rose from a small industrial town. He could see the railway yard clearly now. Lines of train cars, a few anti-aircraft positions. "Stay close," Jack told Red. "We hit the trains, then the trucks. Quick in, quick out." He lowered the nose and dove. The Thunderbolt picked up speed fast, wind howling around the canopy. The gun sight filled with the image of the rail yard. Jack fired short burst. The 8.50s roared at once, the recoil shaking the whole aircraft. The tracers cut through the air and struck the train line. The lead car exploded, flames spreading along the track. Flak erupted from the ground almost instantly, bright orange bursts at their altitude. The plane jolted as fragments hit the wings. Jack pulled up slightly, leveled out, and fired again at a fuel truck on a parallel road. It vanished in a ball of smoke. Behind him, Red's voice broke through the radio. Hawk 2, target's down. How about movement by the yard office? Copy that, Jack replied. Hit it and pull out. They banked sharply, climbing low over the treetops. The ground below blurred past. Fields, smoke, then the first line of German tracers chasing upward. A shell hit near Jack's left wing, rattling the cockpit. Warning lights flashed briefly but went out again. The P-47 held together. Back over open country, the squadron reformed. Kane's voice came in again. All flights, check status. Jack answered, Hawk 2, light damage. Still flying. Red added, Hawk 3, all clear. They climbed back toward the channel. The air was rough, turbulence mixing with the smell of burned oil. Jack glanced at his gauges. Oil pressure steady. Fuel low. He exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on the control stick. Not bad for our first run. Red laughed faintly. Yeah, not bad for lunatics. When they landed back at Halesworth, the mechanics rushed to meet them. Lucky Lady had several holes through the left wing and one through the tail, but nothing critical. Captain Kane came over as Jack climbed down. Good shooting, he said. Intel reports heavy damage at the rail yard. Command's impressed. Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead. They should try flying through it sometime. Kane smiled faintly. They won't. That's our job. Over the next few weeks, the 56th flew mission after mission. Trains, bridges, trucks. The pattern was always the same. Takeoff, low approach, strike, return. The Germans adapted again, placing heavier flak around key routes. The risk increased with every sortie, but so did the results. Supply convoys to the coast slowed, communication lines broke, and entire divisions found themselves short on fuel and ammunition. The Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was now the hammer of the Allied advance. WW2 July. Reports from captured German officers began to circulate. The name Thunderbolt was spoken with respect and fear. The Luftwaffe command issued new orders. Avoid direct engagement with American P-47 formations below 10,000 feet. Jack heard that report during a briefing and said quietly to Red, Guess we finally made the list. Red grinned. About time. That night, the squadron ate dinner in near silence. The mess tent lights flickered in the wind. Outside, the sound of engines being tested rolled through the dark. Jack sat at the table, writing in his notebook again. June 27th, low-level mission, Lille Rail Yard. Heavy flak, no losses. P-47 performs well under damage. Germans adapting. So are we. He closed the notebook and looked out the tent flap. A line of Thunderbolts sat in the moonlight, scarred, patched, but ready. The machine that had once been mocked as slow and clumsy was now feared across occupied Europe. IT no longer needed to prove itself. It only needed to keep flying. August 19th, 1943. Over northern France. The mission code was Operation Starkey, a feint meant to convince the Germans that an Allied invasion was imminent. The RAF and the USAF would strike at targets along the French coast to test German air readiness. For the 56 Fighter Group, that meant another day in the air over enemy territory, this time deeper and heavier than before. The morning began early. The sky was clear, but the air carried the stillness that often came before bad weather. Mechanics moved quickly between the Thunderbolts, loading ammunition and checking fuel lines. The pilot stood nearby, quiet, sipping coffee from tin mugs. Captain Arthur Kane read the day's orders from a clipboard. We're escorting the bombers to the Pas-de-Calais. Enemy activity's been heavier than usual. Expect contact near Abbeville. Once the bombers reach target, we switch to ground support, strafing the rail lines. Any questions? No one spoke. The routine no longer needed explanation. Kane looked directly at Jack Matthews. You'll lead Blue Flight. Stay tight on the bombers until I call you down. Morgan stays with you. Yes, sir. Keep altitude advantage. Don't dogfight. Hit fast, pull up. Jack nodded. He'd heard it 100 times. Still, it mattered. The T-745, the P-47's taxi to the runway. The engines growled in sequence, a line of metallic thunder across the field. Jack's canopy rattled as Lucky Lady rolled forward. He gave a thumbs up to his crew chief and pushed the throttle to full power. The plane accelerated, lifted cleanly off the ground, and joined the formation heading east. The bombers were already high over the channel when the thunderbolts reached them. Dozens of B-17s gleamed in the sunlight, formation perfect, engines droning in rhythm. Jack climbed above them, Red on his right wing. Feels quiet, Red said over the radio. Jack replied, That's the part one don't like. They crossed the French coastline 20 minutes later. The ground below was flat farmland, divided by narrow roads. Thin columns of smoke rose where other formations had already struck earlier targets. The T-20,000 feet, everything looked calm. Then the first warning came through. Bandits, 3 o'clock high, 30 plus. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Jack scanned the sky. Small black dots were approaching fast from the east. He could already see the flashes of sunlight on spinning propellers. Captain Kane's voice broke in. All flights, break formation. Blue Flight, stay on the bombers. The rest, intercept. The radio erupted with overlapping chatter. They're diving in. Watch your 6. Hawk 5, I'm hit. Jack tightened his grip on the stick. Stay with me, Red. We hold until the first pass. The German fighters came down like arrows, engines screaming. Tracers flashed past the bombers. One B-17 in the lower formation caught fire and began to fall, leaving a black trail of smoke behind it. Jack rolled hard left, turning into the dive of a Messerschmitt 109. He fired a burst. Too soon, the rounds missing wide. The German banked sharply, overshooting, then dove again. Jack followed, throttling up, keeping his gun sights centered. The P-47 picked up speed quickly in the dive. Faster than the German could manage at T 400 miles per hour, he fired again. This time, the tracers walked across the 109's fuselage. The canopy burst, and the fighter spun downward. Splash 1, Red said over the radio, voice strained. I saw it. Good, Jack replied. Stay sharp. There's more. Above them, a group of FW-190s tore through the bomber stream, guns blazing. The sky turned chaotic, contrails twisting, planes crossing at impossible angles. Blue Flight, engage. Kane's voice ordered. Jack pulled into a climb, lining up behind one of the attackers. The 8 Brownings fired again, a full second burst. Pieces flew off the German's wing, and it rolled violently before disintegrating. Then a voice crackled through the radio. Hawk 6, going down. Engines out. Jack looked down just in time to see a thunderbolt trailing smoke, spiraling toward the ground. No parachute appeared that he didn't have time to think. Another 190 flashed across his nose. Jack yanked the stick, squeezed the trigger, and the P-47's recoil jolted his shoulder. The round struck the German's tail and exploded the engine. Red status? Still with you. Fuel's fine. I'm hitting the right wing, but still flying. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes. By the time the last German turned away, the sky was scattered with debris and vapor trails. The bombers pressed on, still intact enough to reach their target. Jack looked around. Half his flight was missing. 2 planes smoking, 1 confirmed down. Kane's voice came through, heavy but calm. All Hawks, reform and return to base. On the flight home, the radio was mostly silent. Red spoke once. They hit hard today. Yeah, Jack said quietly. So did we. They landed in late afternoon. The field crews counted the holes in the wings and the patches of burned paint. Lucky Lady had taken 3 hits. 1 through the fuselage, 1 near the tail, and 1 that had dented the armor plate behind Jack's seat. In the debriefing room, Kane stood in front of the map again. We lost 3 aircraft. 5 confirmed kills. Bombers reached target and returned. That's a success by the book. No one said anything. Success was a strange word now. Afterward, Jack and Red sat on the steps outside the hangar, watching the sunset burn over the horizon. The field was quiet except for the distant clatter of tools and the occasional cough of an engine being tested. "They're changing tactics again," Red said. "They're fighting harder." Jack nodded. "They have to. They're running out of time." He looked across the line of Thunderbolts, some still smoking from battle, others already being refueled for tomorrow. The shift in the war was visible now. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies. They could still kill, but they were losing ground, losing pilots, losing fuel. Every mission brought them closer to collapse. Jack opened his notebook and wrote, August 19th, Calais operation. Heavy resistance. Losses acceptable. Germans more desperate. We're wearing them down. He closed it and set it beside him. The war had changed. The Thunderbolt, once dismissed as too slow and too heavy, was now leading the offensive, and for the men flying it, there was no illusion left. Victory would come, but only if they kept climbing back into the same sky, again and again. The laughter from the other side had stopped. Now, there was only the sound of engines and the steady rhythm of men who refused to quit. February 1944. Northern France. Winter had stripped the land of color. The fields below were frozen, streaked with ice and mud. The war had moved inland. Convoys, trains, and supply columns were now the primary targets. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once a high-altitude escort, had become a low-altitude executioner. The 56 Fighter Group operated out of a forward base near the coast, a temporary strip of pure steel planking laid over mud. The airfield stank of oil, cordite, and damp earth. Ground crews worked in gloves without fingertips, their hands blackened with grease that never washed off. Lieutenant Jack Matthews had been flying combat for 10 months. His hair had gone lighter from sun and wind. He no longer wrote much in his notebook. The numbers told the story. 81 missions, 14 confirmed kills, hundreds of ground targets destroyed. He knew the mechanics' names better than the new pilots. He'd stopped trying to remember replacements after the first week. That morning, Captain Arthur Kane stood beside a map laid across a folding table. Intelligence reports a German convoy heading toward the coast near St. Lo. Trucks, armored vehicles, and a few fuel cars. They're retreating from the front. We're to make sure they don't get there. He traced a line on the map. You'll fly in pairs. Altitude 2,000 feet on approach, 500 on attack. Drop tanks off before the run. Keep your speed. The Germans have mounted flak guns on half their trucks. He looked around at the pilots. You all know what that means. Stay low, keep moving, don't circle back for second looks. One pass, then home. Jack and Red Morgan exchanged a look. Red muttered under his breath, one pass, one prayer. Jack didn't respond. T-915. The Thunderbolts lined up on the runway, their engines throwing up clouds of exhaust that hung low in the cold air. Jack's canopy fogged as he taxied. He wiped it with a gloved hand, focusing on the blurred shape of Lucky Lady's nose. The takeoff was rough. The steel planking rattled under the wheels. Once airborne, the formation turned south, climbing above a layer of thin clouds. 20 minutes later, the French countryside came into view, fields, hedgerows, and narrow roads cutting through the terrain. The convoy was visible almost immediately, a column of trucks and armored cars moving slowly along a dirt road lined with trees. Jack pressed his radio switch. There they are. 2 columns heading northwest. We go in from the east. Red replied, copy that. You first, I'll follow. Jack dropped his external tanks and pushed the throttle forward. The P-47 dived. The sound of the wind drowned everything else. The ground rushed up fast. T-600 feet. The first German trucks came into view. He opened fire. The 8 Brownings spat a solid stream of tracers that tore through the column. The lead truck exploded instantly, a second veering off into a ditch. Men scattered in every direction. He climbed slightly, rolled left, and came back for another run. Below, Red's P-47 strafed the center of the convoy, bullets striking fuel drums. A massive fireball erupted, throwing debris into the air. Flak. Left side. Red shouted. Tracer rounds streaked upward from the tree line. Jack banked hard, felt the thud of impacts under his right wing. Warning lights flashed briefly, hydraulic pressure dropping, but the plane held. He turned west, lined up on an armored car, and fired another short burst. The vehicle burst into flames. The gunners stopped firing. The rest of the convoy scattered off the road. Mission complete, Kane's voice said over the radio. All flights head north. Let's not give them a second shot. The Thunderbolts climbed back toward the clouds. Smoke and fire covered the fields below. Red came over the radio again, quieter now. Hawk 2 to Hawk 1. I saw men running down there. We hit them hard. Jack didn't answer right away. They were firing at us, Red. Yeah, I know. Just saying, it's different up close. Jack looked down through the canopy. The burning road stretched for nearly a mile. He could see figures moving through the smoke. He switched off the intercom. The silence inside the cockpit was complete, broken only by the steady hum of the engine. Back at base, the squadron gathered for debrief. The intelligence officer read from his notes. Convoy destroyed. 20 confirmed vehicles. Estimated 50 personnel casualties. Minimal damage to our side. Kane closed the folder. Good work. Command's pleased. The room was quiet. The pilots didn't celebrate. They never did anymore. That night, Jack sat on an empty fuel crate beside his aircraft. The ground crew worked nearby, patching bullet holes with aluminum sheets. He watched them in silence. Red walked up, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. You're thinking about today, he said. Yeah. Don't. It's their war too. I know. Just feels closer than usual. Red sat beside him. You remember when we just escorted bombers? At least we didn't see what we hit. Jack nodded slowly. Back then, I used to think distance made it easier. Now I'm not sure. A mechanic climbed onto the wing and spoke down to Jack. You're lucky. That flak round tore through your wing spar. Another few inches and you'd be walking home. Jack forced a half smile. Good thing she's built like a tank. The man laughed lightly. Yeah, she takes care of you. You take care of her. By April, the missions grew even more relentless. The Thunderbolts flew up to 3 sorties a day. Bridges, supply depots, artillery positions, anything that moved or could move. The Germans called them Jabos, fighter bombers, and feared them more than any bomber formation. Captured German reports describe the attacks. The American low-flying aircraft strike without warning. Their firepower is overwhelming. Morale among ground troops has been severely affected. Jack read that line during a briefing and closed the file without comment. He didn't feel pride anymore, just fatigued that he wrote in his logbook that evening. February 21st. Convoy destroyed near St. Lo. 1 aircraft damaged. No losses. Flak increasing. Civilian areas nearby. Hard to tell targets from towns now. He put the pen down, staring at the page. His handwriting had grown rough and uneven. Outside, Lucky Lady sat alone under a canvas tarp, riddled with patched holes from the day's mission. Jack stepped out into the cold, his breath visible in the dark. He touched the plane's wing as he passed, the metal still warm from the day's flight. The P-47 had become the most feared weapon in the Allied arsenal. But the cost was no longer measured in planes. It was measured in what the pilots carried back each night. The images of what lay burning below. The war was turning in their favor, but every victory left its mark. May 1944, RAF Halesworth, England. The days were longer now. The sun lingered in the sky until nearly 10, painting the airfield in pale gold before fading into the same gray that had hung there since the war began. On the far side of the runway, rows of P-47 Thunderbolts sat lined like soldiers at attention, patched, weathered, and scarred from a year of constant combat. In the control tent, the smell of coffee and engine oil mixed with cigarette smoke. The pilots of the 56 Fighter Group gathered around the operations table, where a large, folded map of northern France was covered in red grease pencil markings. Captain Arthur Kane spoke quietly, his voice steady and direct. We've been hitting rail lines, fuel depots, and airfields for months. Now it's time to cut everything they've got left. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. High Command won't confirm it, but you've all heard the rumors. The invasion's close. Maybe weeks. Our job is to make sure the Germans can't move men or fuel anywhere near the coast when it starts. He pointed to the circled areas on the map, Caen, St. Lo, and the bridges over the Orne and Vire rivers. Those are the arteries. You take them out, their army bleeds. Lieutenant Jack Matthews listened silently, hands in his pockets. He'd stopped taking notes in briefings months ago. He no longer needed reminders of how to survive. Red Morgan sat beside him, chewing on a piece of gum, his helmet resting on his knee. When the meeting ended, the pilots stood in a loose group outside the tent. Engines were already warming up on the flight line, their deep vibration shaking the ground. Red stretched and looked at Jack. If the invasion really is coming, this will be the last big push. Jack zipped his jacket. That's what they said in February. Red grinned faintly. Guess we just keep pushing till someone tells us to stop. The morning air was cool and dry as the pilots climbed into their aircraft. Jack ran a gloved hand across the side of Lucky Lady. The paint was chipped and faded, the name barely legible now. Corporal Delaney, his crew chief, handed him a clipboard. All systems checked. Guns loaded, tanks full. Try to bring her back in one piece this time. Jack nodded. No promises. At 8:10, the flight rolled down the runway, engines at full throttle. The roar of 24 Thunderbolts drowned everything else. They lifted into the sky, climbing east toward France. The radio was alive with static and coded chatter from other squadrons. The air war had become a constant machine. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance, all moving in relentless rhythm as they crossed the channel. The coast of Normandy came into view. Smoke rose from several towns already hit by previous raids. The mission was simple: destroy transport hubs along the Kent-St. Lo line. Jack descended with his flight to 8,000 feet. Below, the countryside was a patchwork of fields and hedgerows. A convoy of trucks was moving along a narrow road near a small village. Target in sight, Jack said over the radio. Engaging. He rolled the Thunderbolt into a dive. The altimeter spun downward, the wind howling around the canopy. The trucks grew larger in the gun sight. He fired a 2-second burst. The 8 Brownings thundered, tearing through the column. Explosions rippled along the road as vehicles ignited. The Red's voice came through the radio. Good hits. I'm going for the bridge. Jack pulled up sharply, climbing back through the smoke. Flak opened from the tree line, black bursts scattering around the aircraft. He felt the plane shudder as fragments hit the fuselage. The formations circled once, strafing the bridge that crossed the river. The wood and steel structure broke apart under gunfire. Collapsing into the water below, Captain Kane's voice came through. Objective complete. Form up and head home. The Thunderbolts climbed back toward the coast. The radio filled with static again, then silence. Over the channel, the sky was clear. Jack looked down at his instruments. Oil, pressure steady, temperature in the green. Lucky Lady was tired but still strong. Red flew alongside, his wing marked with flak scars. You think this really means it's coming? Jack kept his eyes forward. Yeah, it's close. You can feel it. You think we'll be part of it? We'll be the ones clearing the sky before they even hit the beach. When they landed, the airfield was busier than ever. New aircraft arrived daily. See, 47 transports, gliders, and entire squadrons of fighters. Trucks brought in supplies and fuel drums. Everything pointed to one thing. Something massive was about to happen. That night, the pilots gathered quietly in the mess tent. No music, no cards, just the low hum of conversation and the occasional sound of rain hitting the canvas roof. Captain Kane entered, holding a dispatch. He didn't need to read it aloud. Everyone could see it in his face. It's official, he said. The invasion begins within days. We'll be in the air before the first landing craft touches sand. Jack stared down at his coffee cup. The liquid trembled with the distant sound of engines. Later, he walked out onto the flight line. The moon hung low, the field lit only by the faint glow of maintenance lamps. Mechanics moved between planes, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Red joined him. Hard asleep. Yeah. Red exhaled, watching his breath in the cold air. You ever think about what happens when it's over? Jack took a long moment before answering. I used to. Not so much now. You think we'll make it through the landings? We've made it this far. Red smiled weakly. That's not an answer. No, Jack said, but it's the truth. They stood in silence, listening to the echo of a generator and the distant rumble of waves across the channel. The invasion came 2 weeks later. June 6th, 1944, at dawn, hundreds of thunderbolts roared across the channel ahead of a landing craft, sweeping through the Normandy countryside. They bombed artillery positions, strafed coastal roads, and cut rail lines that could bring German reinforcements to the beaches. Jack's squadron was among them. The fields below were filled with smoke and fire, Allied ships visible on the horizon. The air was thick with radio chatter and gunfire. IT was the largest air operation in history, and the Thunderbolt was at its center. Hours later, as Jack circled back toward England, he looked down and saw the beaches, lines of men, landing craft, and wreckage stretching for miles. The sky above them was filled with Allied planes, a living wall of metal and noise. For the first time in 2 years, the thought struck him. This might actually end. When he landed that evening, the airfield was filled with new energy. Mechanics and ground crews crowded around the returning planes, news spreading fast. Allied forces had established a foothold in France. Red ran up to Jack as he climbed out of his cockpit. They did it, he said, grinning for the first time in months. They're ashore. Jack nodded. Yeah, they're ashore. He looked at Lucky Lady, oil leaking, paint scorched but still intact. The machine had carried him through everything. That night, the sound of engines never stopped. Fighters, transports, bombers. Every machine capable of flying took to the air again and again, moving men and supplies to the beachhead. Jack lay in his bunk listening to the endless hum, knowing this was the moment everything had been building toward. The Thunderbolt had done its job. It had been mocked, doubted, and cursed, but it had carried them to this point. And tomorrow it would fly again. May 1945, Western Germany. The war was almost over. The airfields that once shook under the roar of engines now stood quiet, broken only by the occasional cough of an idle generator. The smell of fuel and cordite had been replaced by damp earth and smoke from nearby villages still smoldering from the last battles. The 56th Fighter Group had followed the Allied advance all the way across France, through Belgium, and into Germany itself. Each new base was just another stretch of flat ground scraped clear of debris, covered with steel matting and lined with olive drab tents. Lieutenant Jack Matthews was no longer the same man who had arrived in England 2 years earlier. His flight jacket was faded, the leather stiff and cracked. His logbook listed over 180 missions. He had stopped counting confirmed kills months ago. What he remembered now were the names, friends lost, the sound of voice disappearing mid-transmission, the way the field always seemed too quiet afterward. On the morning of May 7th, he stood beside his aircraft, Lucky Lady. The name was barely visible under layers of grime and repair patches. The right wing bore a line of bullet holes sealed with aluminum plates. The engine had been replaced 3 times. His crew chief, Corporal Delaney, approached carrying a wrench and a mug of coffee. Command says this might be it, he said. Berlin fell. They're talking about surrender any hour now. Jack nodded. Feels strange, doesn't it? Delaney leaned against the wing. Been waiting years for it to end. Now it doesn't feel real. In the distance, a convoy of Allied trucks rolled past, carrying German prisoners, tired, silent men in torn uniforms. They didn't look like the enemy anymore, just survivors of the same storm. That afternoon, the squadron assembled near the command tent. Captain Arthur Kane read the message from higher command aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion in his throat. Hostilities with Germany will cease effective 00:01 hours, May 8th, 1945. No one cheered. For a few seconds, there was only stillness. Then, one of the mechanics clapped quietly, another followed, and soon the entire group joined in, soft, uncertain applause that faded almost as quickly as it started. Jack turned away and looked out over the runway. The Thunderbolts stood in neat rows, silent for the first time. That night, a small bonfire burned near the tents. The men gathered around it, trading the kind of half smiles that come from exhaustion rather than joy. Red Morgan sat across from Jack, turning a tin cup in his hands. "So, what now?" Red asked. Jack shrugged. "Go home, I guess. Figure out what that means. You ever think about staying in?" "Maybe. I don't know how to be anything else anymore." Red took a long sip of coffee. "You remember our first mission? You could barely keep formation." Jack smiled faintly. "Yeah, and you wouldn't shut up about how ugly this plane was." Red grinned. "Still is." They both laughed, the first real laugh in months. It lasted only a moment before the silence settled again. Later, Jack walked alone to the edge of the airfield. The night was clear. The smell of spring hung faintly in the air. For once, there were no engines, no flares, no gunfire. Just quiet. He sat down on a crate and pulled out his old notebook, its pages creased and yellowed. The last entry was dated March 1945. He turned to a blank page and began to write slowly, the pen shaking slightly in his hand. May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe is over. We flew, we fought, we lived. Some didn't. The plane did everything we asked of her, and more. They called her heavy, slow, a joke. She carried us through the worst days of our lives. I think she earned her name. That he closed the notebook and looked back toward the line of thunderbolts, their wings reflecting the faint glow of the bonfire. A few hours later, the squadron's chaplain came around, shaking hands, offering quiet words. He stopped beside Jack. "You'll miss it, won't you?" Jack nodded. "Every part of it I hated." When dawn came, the airfield was covered in fog. The men stood together for one last group photograph. No speeches, no ceremony, just the click of the camera and the sound of boots shifting in the mud. Then they began to pack. Some of the pilots were headed home within weeks. Others would transfer to the Pacific. Jack didn't know yet where he'd go. He only knew that for the first time in years, the sky above him was empty. As he climbed the ladder one last time to sit in the cockpit of Lucky Lady, he ran his hand over the worn metal of the control stick. The seat felt familiar, the smell of oil and leather still there. That he sat for a long moment, looking out across the field. The silence felt heavier than any mission he'd flown. That he whispered softly, "You did good, girl." He climbed down, took one last look at the plane, and walked toward the trucks waiting by the road. Behind him, rows of P-47s stood motionless under the pale German morning. They had done their job. For 2 years, German pilots had laughed at the machine. Now, there was no one left to laugh. And for the men who flew it, the sound of its engine would never leave their memory, because for a time, that sound had meant survival. Chicago, 1950.5 years had passed since the war ended. The city looked different now, cleaner, brighter, louder. Neon lights reflected on the wet pavement, streetcars rattled along the avenues, and most people had stopped talking about Europe entirely. Jack Matthews walked home from the factory each evening along the same route, lunch pail in one hand, jacket slung over his shoulder. The job wasn't bad. Machinist at a small aircraft parts company. It paid enough, but the noise of the drills and presses still reminded him of engines. Every sharp clang took him back to a runway somewhere in France that he had married briefly, then divorced quietly. Red Morgan had gone back to Oklahoma to run his father's farm. Captain Arthur Kane had stayed in the service, now flying desk jobs at the Pentagon. Corporal Delaney wrote once from California, working on experimental jet engines. Jack didn't keep in touch much. The war had bound them together, but peace had scattered them like leaves in wind. That on most Sundays, he took a bus to the small airfield outside the city. It was a civilian strip now, flight school, crop dusters, and a few restored warboats. The first time he went, he told himself it was just curiosity, but he kept returning. That spring, the local historical society announced an exhibit, the Thunderbolt, Guardian of the Skies. One of the last operational P-47s was on display, recently brought back from storage. Jack went alone. The plane sat inside a hangar, its olive paint polished, its metal skin spotless. The 8.50 caliber gun ports had been sealed, but the shape was unmistakable. Broad wings, heavy fuselage, the thick nose that once hid a roaring engine. That he stopped a few steps away. A young boy, maybe 12, was reading the information plaque aloud to his father. It says the Germans called it the Jug because it was big and slow. His father smiled. Yeah, but it could take a beating. The boy pointed at the photograph beside the plane, rows of pilots standing on an airfield. Did they win? His father nodded. They did. The boy moved on. Jack stayed as he walked slowly around the aircraft, hand brushing the cool metal. The smell of old oil still lingered faintly. For a moment, it felt like being 22 again, sitting in that cramped cockpit over France. Engine rumbling beneath him, the world reduced to sky, gauges and gunfire. He stepped closer to the nose and noticed the faded lettering painted just below the canopy. Lucky Lady. He froze. The same name, the same placement, the same curve of the letters. It couldn't be, he thought. But as he looked closer at the small repair patches under the right wing, the ones covered in newer rivets, he knew that IT was her. He ran his hand over the name, tracing each letter. The years fell away. He could almost hear the radio chatter, the voice of Red Morgan laughing through the static, the metallic thud of flak hitting the fuselage. A museum volunteer approached, clipboard in hand. Beautiful, isn't she? Jack nodded. Yeah, she was the best there was. Came back from Europe in 45. Sat in storage for a while. We restored her last year. You a pilot? Used to be, Jack said quietly. A long time ago. The volunteer smiled politely and moved on. Jack stayed beside the plane, alone in the hum of the hangar. He took a folded photograph from his wallet, a creased black and white image of his old squadron standing in front of their Thunderbolts. Red was on his left, Kane on his right. They were all smiling, all still alive in that frozen moment. He placed the photo on the wing for a second, then slipped it back into his pocket. Before leaving, he looked up at the cockpit. The sunlight from a window reflected off the glass canopy. Just as it had so many mornings in England, he whispered, "We made it, girl." Outside, the sky was bright and cloudless. The sound of a training plane drifted overhead. A newer model, faster, sleeker, nothing like the heavy machine that had carried him through the war. But Jack knew something those new pilots didn't. He had seen what courage looked like when wrapped in steel and sweat. He had flown a machine built not for glory, but for survival. He paused by the hangar door, hands in his pockets, watching the plane one last time. The world had moved on, but the memory of the Thunderbolt remained. 8 guns, a roar like thunder, and the stubborn will to keep flying when everything else was falling apart. Jack turned toward the sunlight and walked away, leaving the hangar quiet behind him. The laughter that once mocked the plane was long gone. What remained was respect, earned in blood, sky, and steel. And for the men who flew her, the sound of that engine would always mean one thing: they had survived.